The Pre-Med Year, session number 387. Hello, and welcome to the Pre-Med Years, where we believe that collaboration, not competition, is key to your success. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Gray, and in this podcast, we share with you stories, encouragement, and information that you need to know to help guide you on your path to becoming a physician. Welcome to the Pre-Med Years. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, and I am excited to have a conversation with Phil from Blueprint MCAT, formerly known as NextStep Test Prep. And we're going to talk all about who an MCAT course is good for and why maybe you should think about an MCAT course, maybe tutoring or studying on your own. And we're going to talk about some fun stuff that Blueprint MCAT has done with their MCAT course, a course that I have recommended from NextStep Test Prep previously. Now I recommend it even more. We're going to talk all about that and much more in our conversation today. If you want to check out the MCAT course from Blueprint, then you should go to medicalschoolhq.net/blueprint. Again, that's medicalschoolhq.net/blueprint, and that'll take you to the Blueprint course. And if you sign up, I get a little bit of beer money. So I would recommend, I would encourage you to use that coupon or that URL, medicalschoolhq.net/blueprint. Give me a little bit of beer money. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. Say hello to Phil from Blueprint MCAT. Phil, welcome to the Pre-Med Years and the MCAT podcast. We're going to play this episode on both. How are you doing today?
Good. Double whammy.
Double whammy. Phil from Blueprint MCAT, formerly known as NextStep Test Prep.
Yes. Formerly known as NextStep, like formerly known as Prince. This is this is going to be like a little bit of a difficult transition. I know I'm going to keep saying NextStep just naturally, even though technically we merged with Blueprint 2 years ago. We're just now kind of like building out the new rebranding stuff. Yeah.
So NextStep Test Prep, and I'm sure it'll slip out of my mouth as well, is now Blueprint MCAT. And Phil, do you know, for everyone listening, is that website and everything as well? Everything will be through Blueprint?
Yep, everything's through Blueprint. Although if you go to nextsteptestprep.com, it will redirect you to Blueprint.
Yep.
So just making sure that you're going to be able to find it if you need to.
Yeah, I just tested it. Definitely takes you to Blueprint prep.com/MCAT. So very cool. Well, I'm excited. I think we have talked in the past. I'm not sure if we talked about the merger with Blueprint. And ultimately, the merger for the students' perspective is kind of behind the scenes. But what we'll talk about a little bit later is the kind of the fun stuff. A lot of the technology that Blueprint brings to the table is now coming out in NextStep's new course. But before we dive in, or NextStep's new course, see what I did there? In
Yeah.
Blueprint MCAT's new course. So the question that I have for you is related to courses, because I go online and students will ask on Student Doctor Network, they'll ask on Reddit, they'll ask in my Pre-Med Hangout, should I do a course? Is a course worthwhile? What course should I take? And there's such a huge range of responses. You get the really gung-ho students who are like 520 studying themselves going, it's a waste of money to buy a course. That's ridiculous. Don't let anybody take your money. You can do it yourself. And then you have the other people who are like, oh my God, I loved my Blueprint course, my Kaplan course, whatever it is. And you should definitely use that one. Now, obviously, the answer is always somewhere in the middle. And so
Right.
For your perspective, because you're in a unique position to both do the office hours for the Blueprint MCAT course and do one-on-one tutoring. In your mind, let's start from the basics. Who should look at getting a course?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you're right. Like I do have kind of like a little bit of weird background. I've taught as like a post-bac program. I've taught for a couple of different companies, like in-class stuff. I've done online stuff, and I've done tutoring stuff as well. I think so. Whether or not a course is right do think it's really important to understand that something is needed. It's impossible to prep for the MCAT just by like picking up your old science textbooks and all the like the courses that, you know, the exams that you took in undergrad and all the classes you took in undergrad and reviewing those notes. Like that's not going to be enough. The MCAT is a monster of an exam, and it tests. There's some things on the MCAT that are a little bit unfair in a way, things that they expect you to know about for the MCAT that even if you have a biology degree, there's a chance that you never saw this. And so you need some exposure to something. And I think that a course is obviously a really good way to do that because it's a little bit more organized. Now, like the tutoring stuff or kind of like prepping on your own, I mean, you can, in theory, do this just through a book and just kind of like go through a set of books and like, you know, but you're still going to need a set of books. You're still going to need to like lean on some videos if need be for like a complex topics like, you know, like nephrology or electrostatics or electromagnetism. But you need something. You need practice exams. And so there's something that's needed. And so those people that are like, oh, you can do it completely on your own, like you kind of can't, like you do need something going through there. Now, I personally needed a course. I took a course back in the day. It was back before NextStep even existed, actually. And so before Blueprint, before NextStep, I took an exam or took a course, and it was because I knew myself well enough to know that I needed it.
Well, let me stop you there. Why did you need a course? What was it about yourself that you knew that you were like, I should do a course?
I need structure. Personally, like so the MCAT is such a monster of a test that like people are not taking. Like I talk about this sometimes, like how weird it is to be like, oh, sorry, like best friend, I can't hang out. I have a test in 2 months, right? Like that's not a normal scenario for most people in undergrad. Yep. And so like it's more of a marathon than a sprint. You have to take like a long view towards it. And so you need this, I think structure helps with that because otherwise it's a giant mountain, and knowing like where to start can be very difficult. Knowing how to focus on certain things and how deeply to focus is really important, because a lot of students, if they just go in cold, they assume that, you know, I need to go really deep into orgo because that was something I really struggled with. And like psych is it's kind of like fluffy and like I don't need to look at psych. But you have almost 4 times as many psych questions as you do orgo questions. And I actually think that psych on the MCAT is perhaps a little bit trickier than some of the orgo on the MCAT. Sometimes the orgo questions you can get just by counting the carbons. I'm like, okay, well, I need 9 carbons in my answer, and that one's got 9 carbons, so that's the answer. And that's not really what happens in undergrad. So a lot of times students go into the MCAT and studying for the MCAT based on what they expected in undergrad and what they experienced in undergrad. And I think that that's why something is needed. And I think having some guidance is really important for that, on top of the structure. So guidance and structure, I think those are the 2 big reasons to do a course. Talking to somebody who kind of knows the material.
How does a student know that about themselves?
That's a really good question. So I know that me personally in undergrad, I tended to, you know, kind of put things off every once in a while. And, you know, I would kind of cram, and I would work hard for like a week. Right. And so I would have like 3 weeks before I have an orgo exam. I would kind of like the first 2 weeks, I wouldn't like take it that seriously. That last week I was like nose to the grindstone going hardcore. And that sort of like burst of effort doesn't work with MCAT, because you can't burst with effort for 2 months, and you need to be studying for months to prep for the MCAT. And so I think just the way that I naturally kind of like dealt with stuff in undergrad, it just didn't kind of match what I needed to do for the MCAT.
Yeah. For your perspective, dealing with and working with students, dealing with, you're putting up with those students, working with these students who are going through the course and working with students one-on-one, where do you see overlapping traits that make them successful and different traits that are making one set versus another successful?
Yeah, I think the like self-discipline is kind of important, like, you know, like being able to force themselves to kind of like sit and like go through stuff. I mean, like, as we mentioned, I like do tutoring, and I've had some tutoring students that I'm like, all right, this is the stuff I want you to accomplish this week. And they like, you know, they like on the next day, they're like, yeah, I did all of it. I like got everything done. And I tend to overdo, because students never ask for they never say like, oh, you didn't give me enough to do.
Yeah.
They never say that. So I tend to over prescribe. And sometimes some of those students are like, yeah, I got through all of it. And I'm like, ooh, that's actually pretty impressive. And like kind of like going through this, and they're able to kind of like organize and use their time wisely. And then other students are just like, oh, I didn't do any of it. I just, I started yesterday on it. And so I only got through a couple hours. And that's kind of an important thing. Like, you need to be able to spend a couple of hours every day to really prep for the MCAT. We're talking 300, 350 hours ish. And that's like kind of an average. And it kind of depends on the student. If you're have like really strong background in a lot of the sciences, you might be able to get away with less. If you haven't been in school for a decade, then you might need a little bit more. And so like that's not a hard, fast number. But like to do that, I mean, we're talking, like 40 hours a week, let's say 30 hours a week, right? That's 2.5 months at 30 hours a week to just hit the 300. And so this is something that you kind of need to like have that sort of motivation and kind of like, stay on top of it. And I think that that's a really important thing. A little bit of self-awareness is also important. I think that when students are reviewing questions, there's this tendency to focus more on the questions, on like, what was the right answer for this? What was the wrong answer? Why is it right? Why is it wrong? And then they move on. I think it's really important for students to, like, especially the students that are really successful. I'm talking about the students that get to like the 520s. Like they're approaching those things a little bit differently. They're looking at the questions and saying, not what did I miss and why was this right? They're asking, why did I miss it? And so what was going through my head? And so they're not as much reviewing the question as they are reviewing themselves. They're reviewing how they thought about the question, how they maybe should have thought about the question, rather than just like, what's the right answer? And that's like a little bit of a nuanced thing where they're kind of like focusing a little bit more internally.
It's an interesting way that you put it, because I think if you think about a cookbook, right, everyone potentially starts with the same ingredients. And if you don't have the cookbook and the recipe to follow, you can get a million different kind of final concoctions that are coming out of the oven. And I like how you put it, where it's about why they missed it. The why is really that process. It's the recipe. And if they're repeating the same recipe every time with the same initial ingredients, they're going to get the same junk on the other side. And it's not until they really question that why and question the process of how they're getting to the answer that they actually can break through and start getting the right answers.
Yeah, I like that you related that to cooking stuff. I makes me think of the Great British Bake Off, which I've been binging in the COVID world, where I think the second challenge is they're like given like all the ingredients and like a very bare recipe and just seeing like who can figure out how to put it together. But yeah, it's exactly what it is. Nice. So yeah, and I think that's why analytics are also important. And why tutoring is useful, because, somebody who spend a decade just like dealing with MCAT stuff, they really understand like how you're supposed to look at this and how you're supposed to think about this. And that insight kind of helps versus, somebody who's going into this cold. It's hard to understand what the MCAT wants you to think and how they want you to think it. If you like kind of like are just like new to the world. Yeah. And so analytics are important, because then you can start to find the patterns, which kind of takes us to the new Blueprint course. Yeah. We kind of, it seems like a natural kind of segue into that. We kind of hinted at the stuff that Blueprint brought. We actually, we merged like 2 years ago. We haven't just been like sitting around. We've actually been working on this course for literally 2 years. And like all sorts of things. And like, there's a lot of content and stuff that NextStep has, like the exams are great. The materials are great. But there's some things that Blueprint brought to the table that were really interesting. First off, analytics. Like there are some very high level analytics going through this where you can figure out what kind of questions you're missing. And we spent literally months just tagging questions and going through each question, being able to like tag it with like different topics going through there, so the students can kind of understand what kind of questions they're missing. And that's really important. And then we also created a kind of like interactive Q bank where you can build your own quizzes based on what your weak areas are. And so those two things go together so well, where like, oh, these are my weak areas. I am going to build quizzes over those weak areas, and kind of like going through and, specifically working on what my problem is, and maybe try to like adjust the way that I'm thinking about this this kind of issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of students right now with UWorld in the mix. UWorld obviously very big in the medical school world with their USMLE prep. They have released an MCAT product that students seem to like a lot, and students are asking, what's the difference? And I think that's one of the biggest differences. You can go to UWorld and create question sets based on topics. But with the Blueprint MCAT course, you can take a full length, get your score, know where your weak spots are, because the Blueprint backend, the analytics behind it are saying, hey, here's where you're missing stuff. And you still need to go through and figure out why you're missing those questions. But then you can, because of those full length exams, you can go, okay, I know where my weaknesses are, versus just creating question sets based on topics.
Yeah, and this is a story that I was talking about actually the other day about my personal experience prepping for the MCAT way back in the day.
Back when I was a boy.
Yeah, exactly. I walked uphill both ways to take the MCAT.
No, this is the COVID is now the new uphill both ways. Back when I was a boy, I had to stay inside for 2 months.
Yeah. Man, we had to use MCATs for toilet paper. So yeah, this like that kind of like analyzing your full length exams. I talked about this. We actually did a webinar not too long ago, but the big breakthrough I had with cars specifically, the sciences I was doing kind of okay with, because I would study science or like physics or biology, and then I was better at physics and biology, but there's nothing to study for cars. And so for months, nothing happened until one day it was like literally months. My car score was flat. It was my weakest area, like from the beginning, and then everything else was growing. And then it was now even weaker in comparison. It was about the same, but I went back and I worked through multiple exams. I spent 4 hours just trying to look for patterns on the types of questions that I was missing and why I was missing them, and just trying to understand my thought process. And because for months before that, I would just do a passage, look at a question, why did I miss this? Oh, okay, that answer makes sense. B makes sense. I should have picked that. And then I'll just move on. And then I'm not asking why and what's kind of going on with the patterns of why I'm missing questions. But I did this, and I spent 4 hours going through exams. The next day I took a test and my car score jumped up 5 points, and it didn't go down after that. It kept going up. And it was just because I started to understand, these are the sorts of questions that I'm missing, and this is why I'm missing them, is because I'm bringing in outside information, specifically on these questions where they start with suppose blah, 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 the sort of strength and weaken questions, or application, the kind of reasoning beyond the text questions. Anytime the question brought in new info, I would bring in new info. And that's something that I didn't recognize and realize until I spent literally hours going through this. And this is after months, and I just wasn't aware. If I had taken the new Blueprint course, I would take my first exam, and that analytics would already be done. And so I wouldn't even have to realize that I need to do the analytics, and then I wouldn't have to spend hours putting that together after I'd spent months prepping. And that just would have made my experience a whole lot smoother. And I would have improved a lot quicker. It would have been a lot less painful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that idea of just analytics is something that me personally, honestly, that was the thing that made the biggest difference in my car score specifically. But that was the time my MCAT score jumped the most in my prep, is just through that power of analytics.
Yeah. And analytics is a kind of a big word that's doesn't really mean anything, but really just review, right? That's analytics, is reviewing what you did, what you got wrong. And then you obviously have to put in the work to go through and figure out why you got it wrong. But at least you have the data there that shows the types of questions that you're missing.
Yeah, that's the scientist in me. More data is always the answer, right? As long as we have more data, we can figure out anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one of the big things that happened with Blueprint, that merger, the analytics stuff. They brought a lot of power number crunching stuff to that.
Yeah.
The other big thing was the video, videographers and animators and illustrators. Our original course, me and Clara and Brian and Andrew, we're all making images in Microsoft Paint with just weird blobs. This is an enzyme, right? This is clearly made in Microsoft Paint. Looks like Pac-Man. And now we have animators and illustrators. And so we're able to say like, oh no, we want to make this, but we want to make it animated to kind of like move around. And the power of an image, or like if an image speaks 1,000 words, then a video does 1,000 images. So that'd be like 1,000,000 words. And so there are some things where you can kind of like read it in a paragraph, and you read it and you reread it, and you're just trying to make sense of it. It's kind of not sticking, versus you see some video that explains it in 20 seconds. You're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then you just kind of like move on. And so the power of like a great video is something that's really exciting. And I know that we worked on the videos with like scripts and, kind of like behind the scenes here, scripts and animators and illustrators and, like teleprompters and like the whole thing. And so the video quality is much higher than
so much better.
It's like so much better than just like how it used to be, where I was just like sitting in front of my computer, filming myself talking, and like doodling in Microsoft Paint. And that was, that was the old version.
Yeah. So much better. One of the things that people or students going through courses often find is that they have so much information laid out in front of them. And it's almost like here's where I need to start, here's where I need to finish. And every student is so different on that journey. Some are coming with really heavy chemistry backgrounds, biology backgrounds, psychology backgrounds. And so reviewing that stuff for them may be a waste of time. And I think one of the cool things that I like is that you can kind of test out of sections of the course so that you have some reassurances without just skipping the section. You have some reassurances that you know the kind of the key takeaways that you should have.
Yeah. Absolutely. And like no two students, like even if students have similar backgrounds, if I have two biology majors, like there's a lot of difference between that, even if they went to the same school, let alone like I once had two students. One was a biology PhD from Oxford, and the other student was an animator at Pixar. And like, obviously those students have very different backgrounds and very different like strengths and weaknesses, and what they need to work on is not nearly the same thing. And so the ability to kind of adapt to your strengths and weaknesses. And that's something that's really important. Even if you're going in just like cold and you know nothing about the MCAT and it's just time to get started and I need to prep for that, that's a really useful thing, because there are some things you are stronger and weaker at. I personally, I know I'm in the minority, but I love physics. And so I probably could have tested out of some of the like kinematics and electrostatics and magnetism stuff. But I definitely needed to review a lot more of like definitely psychology. But chemistry and bio and some of those like more difficult things. Like I didn't take anatomy and physiology. So all the stuff with nephrology and immunology are things that I didn't get in undergrad. And they're not a prereq, but those things are kind of tested on the MCAT. Versus other students will have taken those courses. Yeah. And so even if you're coming in cold, super useful. But if you have some background, like if you're retaking the exam, or if it's just been a while since you've been in school, I think it's even more useful in those cases.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that comes up all the time when it comes to studying for the MCAT, whether it's self-studying, whether through a course or something else, is how do I create a schedule? And I think the schedule builder is an amazing tool. Can you talk about kind of the behind the scenes of that?
Yeah. So once again, students are different. And like there are some students that are parents. There are some students that, like even if you take like the general students, like in like, the classic college MCAT student, their lives are all different. Like what classes are they taking? What are their like outside activities? Like are they in a sorority, or a fraternity? I like combined those into one word there. Are they in like a fraternity? Are they volunteering? Are they shadowing? Like their lives are very different. And so the ability to create a study schedule that's built around your life, the ability to, I need to take off every other Wednesday, and I need to take off the first Tuesday of every month because I have this big meeting. My Thursdays tend to be lighter, and so I'm going to try to do much more work on Thursdays. And most Sundays I play volleyball, so I'd like to take those days off. I could go play volleyball after I go to church, and so I think that is really nice to kind of build it. And that's just like kind of a set thing. But like if you have like something big come up, right? Like I had a student that I was working with and they were getting married in the middle of this. And like, obviously they need to not have homework on their wedding day. And maybe the week before the wedding and maybe during their honeymoon, they should take it a little bit lighter and not,
I don't know.
not be doing homework.
It doesn't sound like a supportive spouse if they won't let them do homework on their wedding day.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There we go. We need to like get the spouse in on there too. Like these are the days I'm going to be doing flashcards with you. Yeah. And so this, like the ability to kind of like build a schedule around your life. Like what day are you taking the test? What day are you starting? What are the days you need off? What are the days you have more time? What are the days you have less time? What are the things you need to work on a little bit more specifically? And we'll work in extra practice in on those topics. And having this kind of schedule put out for you where, oh, this is what I have to do this day. It's so much easier. It's like it takes a load off your mind. It's really hard. I mean, prepping for the MCAT is a difficult enough task by itself. Like trying to figure out how to prep for the MCAT is also like kind of a difficult task. And ones that students don't have a lot of exposure to. And you know, if you really understood everything on the MCAT, then you wouldn't need to study for the MCAT. So it's hard for someone who doesn't know the MCAT to know how to schedule their time and what to spend more time on and what to spend less. Like I talked about high yield and low yield stuff. And so that's really important, being able to kind of like adapt to your schedule. And then if something happens and it gets more like your life gets more difficult or something happens, like maybe somebody gets sick or maybe you're trapped at home and you didn't plan on being trapped at home. And so like, I'd like to get a lot more stuff done. The Blueprint study scheduler is adaptable. And so you can tweak it around and adjust it as you're going through it. And it really helps to have this, like as you're crossing things off, it takes the MCAT from a large, scary, overwhelming monster into just like a list, like a series of tasks. And the power of being able to just cross off a task is like, it's something that you shouldn't underestimate, because burnout is a huge thing with the MCAT, being able to stay motivated and stay on top of it because you're prepping for months in most cases. So the ability to kind of like see the progress that you're making, like as you're crossing through things, as you're getting through this, you can kind of like look back and like, oh, this is all the stuff that I've done. And you can recognize and realize like, oh, I'm definitely making progress here. Even if like you haven't taken an exam for a while, or even if your exam, like maybe your score didn't go up like you had hoped, you can still see the progress that you're making. It makes it a lot easier to stay motivated and stay on top of it, which is a battle in and of itself.
Yeah. Definitely is. And one of the biggest things that I think really separates the Blueprint course from others is the 2 hours a day, 5 days a week of access to you and other top tutors and MCAT experts at Blueprint. Talk about what those office hour days look like if a student is in a course, how they sign on to those and what you're covering, or is it a free-for-all, what students are struggling with? What do those look like?
Yeah, so office hours are traditionally like pretty low, like small groups, like, you know, somewhere between, I had one yesterday that had 3 people in it because we were reviewing a very specific exam that only some students had taken, or up to 30. And like going through that, we kind of like dive a little bit deeper into topics. If students are confused on a topic, which is very easy when you look at the kind of material that we're talking about on the MCAT, like fluid dynamics, it's very easy to get kind of like tripped up a little bit. And so office hours are a really great resource to kind of like clarify any questions or dive a little bit deeper, maybe get some insight into understanding the mind of the MCAT makers, and kind of how you should be thinking and tackling passages, or doing data interpretation, how you should be interpreting this. Or if you're going through a passage, what stuff should you care about and what stuff doesn't matter? Like as I'm reading a passage, there's a lot of stuff that's just fluff. And I don't understand this sentence, but it doesn't matter. Let's just move past it. This is very crucial. There's going to be a question on that. And that's a really useful thing to be able to work on. And it really helps to have somebody who knows the material to go through that. And so currently, yeah, there's 10 hours a week of office hours. I do 8 of the hours. The other 2 hours are done by Azai, who is a medical student at Harvard. And so we kind of like put this all together. I think one of the biggest things with office hours, though, it's really interesting. I can't tell you how many office hour students we've had that have come to every single office hours for like months. I know we had one student that went to every office hours for 5 months straight, 10 hours a week, every week. He didn't miss one. And I think that, like, that's not that rare. There's a little bit of a community. Like, the students are like telling jokes and we're interacting with each other. Like, we know where everyone is. Some people are on, like, I don't want to name any names because that's like a little bit weird, but we have a student in Idaho who grew up on a farm, and so we kind of joke about, because we're the farmers. And then we have a student that is from London and like trying to get into med school here. We have a student that is that works at a homeless shelter in LA. And so just kind of like hearing stories and talking about that and kind of like relating the stuff that we're dealing with at the MCAT through examples, things that like stick in our mind. And so it's kind of a little bit more of a community. And I would say that there's an easy like 15, 20 students that come to at least like 80% of the office hours, and they're kind of the same students. And I know that it helps them stay motivated and makes it more interesting. I had a student say the other day that the only reason they come is just to hear me hear my jokes, which they need to like get access to Comedy Central or something like that, because my jokes are mostly dad jokes.
Yeah. So really, office hours, again, I think really helps separate. If a student, so you mentioned yesterday there you were covering a very specific test. If a student has very specific questions about something that's not supposed to be covered, how is that handled?
Well, so most of the questions come from exams. And so the very specific exam we were talking about was actually something from the AAMC. So we were going through one of the AAMC exams, and they're the ones who actually like put together the actual MCAT. And so like obviously anything on there is good. I'm not shy. Like most students, if I ever see a question and I'm just like, okay, you probably don't need to know this in this detail. And then a student will be like, well, it was on a test. And I'm like, yeah, but it was in a passage. And so a lot of times the MCAT will throw passages at you with things that they know you're not comfortable with. And they just want to see, can you understand what's going on in the passage? So you don't have to necessarily be familiar with this topic going in, but you do need to be able to dissect and understand the passage. And that's another sort of thing that is just kind of like getting that insight makes it a lot easier, because other students will end up going and studying like really in depth on something that they actually don't need to know about, but they saw a question about it and they thought they needed to know about it because there was a question about it. Actually, and then you can kind of have like the flip of that, where that student kind of didn't understand something from a passage. I had another student take an exam. This happened just earlier this week, and they missed a question because they brought in a lot of outside knowledge because they knew a lot about acetazolamide, and the passage was about it. And I'm like, okay, yes, like the ideas you have, it's not perfect. Like there's a couple of gaps they're missing, which is why they missed the question, is because there's some of the facets of the drug. But the MCAT doesn't expect you to know about those things. So there's something in the passage. Like as I read that question, I'm like, this is not something I'm supposed to know about. This is something that's going to be in the passage. And so if I'm trying to look internally to find that answer, I'm making a mistake, because this is something outside this box of information that I'm going to be responsible for. And so starting to recognize and understand that's another big reason to take a course or go to office hours, is because like if you are coming in cold to the MCAT, it can be hard for students to recognize like what stuff am I being held accountable for? What stuff do I need to know? And what stuff is just something in a passage that I need to dissect the passage and pull material from that. And so having somebody who, just eats, sleeps, breathes MCAT, like I do, it's really funny. After I took the MCAT, I'm like, I'll never have to look at this again. And then now it's
jokes
all
on
that
you.
I do. Yeah. Oh man. But yeah, and so that's a big piece as well.
Okay. So for a student listening to this, wanting to check out the new Blueprint MCAT course, where should they go?
Yeah, that is a great question. So you want to go to blueprintprep.com. Yeah. Or you could go to nextsteptestprep.com, which would just send you to blueprintprep.com.
No. Let's go to blueprintprep.com.
Yeah, that's probably better.
Yeah.
And so blueprintprep.com, there is a lot of free resources. Do not don't avoid those, because there's some really good resources in there, like a full-length exam, like a diagnostic exam. I do public webinars pretty much weekly for the most part, diving into a lot of like different things in depth. I know the last one we did was on viruses. I thought it was worth going into with the COVID stuff, because the MCAT does expect you to know something about viruses. And so talking about, the lysogenic and lytic cycle and going into that. And so we go into a lot more content. in that. And so we do kind of the public webinars there. There's the full-length exams, the diagnostic exams. You get access to our study planner, which is free. And so everyone should take advantage of that. And a lot of other resources as well.
Yeah. Awesome. So blueprintprep.com, go sign up for the course, go check it out, go sign up for those free webinars and much more. Thanks, Phil, for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. Good to be here.
All right, so there you have it. Again, Phil from Blueprint MCAT. As we are releasing this episode, if you are not part of the Pre-Med Hangout, you should go join, because Phil will be joining us this month as we're releasing this in April, and next month in May for some Q&As inside the Pre-Med Hangout. And if you don't listen to the MCAT podcast, which you can find at mcatpodcast.com, I highly recommend you go check out that podcast as well. Phil is my co-host on that podcast, and we are diving into breaking down all of full-length 1 from Blueprint MCAT. So go check it out, mcatpodcast.com, premedhangout.com if you would like to check out the Facebook group where Phil will be doing his Q&As. And again, go to medicalschoolhq.net/blueprint, which will let Blueprint know that you came from me, and I'll get a little bit of beer money. As I'm releasing this, as I'm recording this, you get to save $300 off of the new online course using the code INTRO300 as we're recording this. Again, medicalschoolhq.net/blueprint will activate my little beer money from you. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the Pre-Med Years.
This is MedEd Media.